Hello everyone and welcome to Student for Liberty's E-Leadership Series. My name is Kelly Jemison and I'm a member of the Executive Board of SFL. We are honored to have David Friedman to deliver a talk tonight on anarchy and efficient law. Before we begin though, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Students for Liberty and the E-Leadership Program. Students for Liberty is a 501c3 nonprofit organization run by students and for students dedicated to liberty. We were formed 2 years ago to serve a previously unfilled niche in our universities, connecting liberty-friendly students with other students, faculty, organizations, and resources to help them advance their ideas and application of classical liberalism. The resources we offer include free books for student groups, a speakers network, protest grants, handbooks on running student organizations, tabling kits, leadership training, and an academic journal for liberty and society, and our bread and butter conferences. The E-Leadership Program is our way of giving you access to the ideas and mentorship in liberty year-round from wherever you are. We hold webinars each week to put you in touch with the top mentors and scholars for liberty in the country. For a full list, please visit our website, studentsforliberty.org. Now I am pleased to introduce our speaker this evening. Professor Friedman is a professor of law at Santa Clara University. His specialties include economics and analytics of law, computers, crime, and privacy. He has published economic analyses of affirmative action, punitive damages, trade secret law, and accident law. Friedman has also written on the topics of price theory, medical care, population economics, the economics of war, historical perspectives on freedom, and criminal defense. Prior to joining the Santa Clara Law faculty in 2005, Friedman taught at Cornell, Tulane, UCLA, the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, and the University of Chicago. David Friedman is the son of Milton and Rose Friedman. His son Patrick Friedman has also written about anarcho-capitalism, particularly seasteading. David Friedman holds an AB from Harvard University and a PhD in Physics of Chicago. Just to note, there will be about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the webinar. Feel free to type in any questions into the question box. For those interested, this webinar will be recorded and archived on our website in the next few weeks. Without further ado, I present to you David.
Hello, everybody. I thought the most useful thing to put on the screen other than me would be my web page. So if anybody's curious, you can go to that and get lots of additional material, including a text version, a chapter I wrote on the same subject that I'm going to be talking about tonight. Conservatives and most libertarians share a problem that I would like to discuss as the beginning of my talk. And the problem is that they believe that governments are very bad at doing things. They believe that if the government is in charge of agriculture, you're likely to have famines. That if the government is in charge of building cars, you're likely to produce poor cars at a high price. And they think that partly because governments usually have the wrong incentives, and partly because they usually have problems solving the design problem of doing things. So conservatives and most libertarians see as the solution to this problem a society where cars and grain are produced privately, where private individuals have property rights, where they have a legal system that lets them trade with each other, freedom of contract, a bunch of characteristics that allow a sort of a decentralized economic system for doing stuff. And the problem with this view of the world is that in order for it to work, you need a legal system. The legal system is being produced by that same government that conservatives and libertarians believe is incompetent at producing things. And as any law student could tell you after his first month or two, designing a legal system is a non-trivial problem. That a legal system, when you actually get down to the nuts and bolts, is a very complicated thing. So if governments can't produce grain and cars, why do you expect them to do a good job of either defining or enforcing rights? And if governments don't do a good job of defining and enforcing rights, then how do you get your free market society to work when the government is the organization that's producing its legal system? That's the basic problem. A different way of putting the problem, turning it around, is to ask, how would you produce a good legal system? Not what would its content be, but under what institutions would the people who are designing laws have an incentive to do a good job? and under what institutions would the people enforcing laws have an incentive to do a good job? How can we get laws produced by something similar to the mechanism that we now use to produce food and cars? And of course, the standard solution to this problem in our society is democracy. We've run that experiment. We've run that experiment many times in many different societies, and none of them did a very good job. And the same arguments that suggest that a democracy won't do a very good job of running agriculture or the auto industry or delivering mail also suggests that it probably won't do a very good job of designing legal systems. I suppose my standard example from the standpoint of an economist would be tariffs, taxes on imports. Economists have known now for about 200 years that a country that imposes a tariff normally is injuring its own inhabitants by doing so. And for 200 years, with only a couple of exceptions I can think of, every country in the world has had tariffs. And that suggests that the incentives of people who are creating legal systems, who are running governments, don't correspond very well to maximizing the welfare of the people they rule. So my solution, which is what I'm going to be talking about tonight, is that you produce laws on the market, that you have a set of institutions in which laws are in effect being created to be sold to customers, in which the service of enforcing rights is being created to be sold to customers, and thus mechanisms at least analogous to ordinary market mechanisms will give you good laws and good law enforcement. And let me start by sketching the institutions in question. Those who are sufficiently interested can find the long account in my first book, The Machinery of Freedom, which, as you can see from my web page, is now available for free on the web. The printed version has been effectively out of print for quite a while. I'm hoping to bring out a third edition sometime in the next couple of years, but at the moment, the only easy way of getting it, unless your library has it, is to download the PDF from my webpage. So how do we set up a free market system for replacing government in its most fundamental function of making and enforcing law? And I'm going to start with what I see as the easy problem. And I'm going to try to show that having solved the easy problem, you can then, as it were, bootstrap that solution into solving the hard problem. What's the easy problem? The easy problem is enforcing agreements between people who are in long-term relations with each other. If you imagine two firms or two individuals who are dealing with each other, the people I hire to mow my lawn or the people who hired me to teach their students, say. If we expect to be dealing with each other for a long time, we have a strong incentive to keep contracts with each other. Because if you cheat me today, I'm not going to trust you tomorrow. And if I can't trust you tomorrow, neither of us can get the benefits from our mutual cooperation. So that's, I think, the easy problem, that you have organizations or individuals who will be dealing with each other on a repeat basis. And you then have what's sometimes called the discipline of constant dealings. The fact that that repeat basis gives both of them an incentive to keep their agreements. That does not solve the problem, however, of enforcing my rights against a firm I will deal with only once. And it certainly does not solve the problem of enforcing my rights against a burglar or a mugger with whom my transaction is not going to be a voluntary one. So how do we solve that problem? And the answer is we solve that problem by having private firms, think of them as rights enforcement agencies, which sell the service of protecting their customers' rights. So you pay some annual fee, and this firm then provides you both the equivalent of police services, somebody you can call if someone robs you, and also access to a legal system, so if you have a dispute with somebody, you have a way of peacefully settling. And the obvious problem with this, which has occurred to everybody from Ayn Rand on down, is what happens when there is a conflict between customers of two different such firms. So I come home and discover that my television set is missing. Actually, I don't own a television set, but let us assume I do. I discover that my nice Macintosh computer is missing. and my rights enforcement agency, which is a high-tech one, has installed a surveillance camera in my house, and looking at its records, we find a picture of my friend John Smith walking out my door carrying my Macintosh computer. So my rights enforcement agency calls up John Smith and says, we understand that you took Mr. Friedman's computer without his permission. Please return it, and we're charging you $20 for the trouble of finding you and getting in touch with you. And Mr. Smith replies, I never saw Mr. Friedman's Macintosh computer. The Macintosh computer I have is one that I got from a friend of mine who sold it to me a few years ago. And if you want the computer back, tough luck. And so my rights enforcement agency says, well, unless you can convince us that it's not his computer, a couple of big strong men are going to show up at your front door, and if you don't open the door, they'll open it, and they'll go take the computer and bring it back to Mr. Friedman. And Mr. Smith replies, well, you know, I have a rights enforcement agency too, and if a couple of your thugs show up at my front door, my rights enforcement agency will send some people to protect me. And now it looks as though we're set up for a nice little war between my rights enforcement agency and his rights enforcement agency, and that's the reason why everybody who has heard of this set of ideas thinks it won't work. But they're wrong. Wars are expensive. My agency and his agency are both profit-maximizing firms, and it will occur to them that there are cheaper ways of settling this dispute than shooting each other. And if it only happened once, they could perhaps agree to find an arbitrator who would settle it. But they, in fact, know that it's going to happen over and over again, that their customers and my firm's customers are in the same general area. They will have clashes of this sort in the future. So the obvious solution is the two firms, the two rights enforcement agencies, agree on an arbitrator, a private court, who will settle disputes between them. And now when the dispute I described arises, the two firms go to the arbitrator. The arbitrator has a trial of some sort. If he concludes that it really is my computer, then Mr. Smith's firm informs him that they are not selling the service of protecting robbers against having to give back what they stole, so they won't protect him, and I get my computer back. On the other hand, if the court rules that he's innocent, it's not my computer, then presumably I or my firm owe some penalty for having bothered Mr. Smith by false accusations. Now, the obvious question is, given this agreement between the two firms, what enforcement? This is a world with no government. There is no overarching court system to enforce contracts between rights enforcement agencies. But we solved that problem already, because the rights enforcement agencies are going to be dealing with each other for a long time. The business they're in will be very much more expensive if they have to fight instead of arbitrate. And it is therefore in their interest, by the discipline of constant dealings, to continue to keep their word. Each one knows that if, when the court rules against his customer, it refuses to go along, then next time when the court rules in favor of his customer, it will do no good, because the other agency will respond in the same manner, will say, if you would keep your agreement, we won't keep ours. So therefore, the two agencies have a strong self-interested motive for abiding by their agreement, and we now have a system in which disputes are being settled by courts, not by violence, and in which individuals are being protected by private firms in the business of protecting them. We have, in effect, made both law and law enforcement into private goods rather than public goods, and we have much better mechanisms for producing private goods than for producing public goods. Now, there's one odd feature about this system that I ought to mention now, and that is that you are not going to have a uniform legal system. The rules that apply between me and Mr. Smith are the rules of the court that my agency and his agency have agreed to. The rules that apply between me and Mr. Jones are the rules of the court, the arbitrator, that my agency and his agency have agreed to, and there's no guarantee those will be the same rules. So in that sense, this is a system of legal diversity. And that may sound strange to you, but of course all of us live in a system of legal diversity, that the law that applies to you is different in the United States and in Canada. It's different in California and in Illinois. And even within a single state, as a lawyer could explain to you, the rule for determining what the law is not as simple as it is the law of the state you're in, because there are many contexts in which somebody from a different state can claim that his state has jurisdiction over a dispute, that you have some connection with his state, and you therefore have a whole area of law dealing with the question of jurisdiction of which legal system applies to what dispute. So in that sense, although my system is more extreme than the one you're in, since the laws that apply will depend on the pair of people the dispute is between, nonetheless, the fact that it's not a single uniform legal system is less surprising or less novel than it at first seems. How diverse will the legal system be? Interesting question. There are clearly some advantages here as elsewhere in standardization. It's going to be easier to do business if the rules that affect your contracts with employees or suppliers or customers are the same whoever they are. And there will therefore be some pressure for the private courts to find reasonably uniform legal rules. Just as in our system, there are various mechanisms by which different states, even different nations, come to have similar rules. But at the same time, there are advantages to differences. There are advantages to specialization. There may be some customers for whom particular legal rules are especially attractive, and there may be agencies which try where they can to get courts that will agree to those rules. So you will have some standardization, but not complete standardization. What kind of law will you get? Well, let's think about the incentives of the firms that are creating the law. These are the arbitration firms, the private courts. They're selling a service. So what do they want to do? They want to create legal rules that agencies will approve of, that agencies will make them choose that court to settle their disputes. What will determine that? Well, the agencies are selling a service. They're selling the service of providing and enforcing law to their customers. So the agencies are going to say for any legal rule, do our customers like it? Will our customers be happy, be more willing to pay for our services if we have one legal rule or another? So you can imagine to start with that a private court thinks of some change in the legal rules that most customers will like, that will make the system better for most customers of both arbitration agencies. It proposes that change. Both agencies say, great, this is improving the product of the quality of our product, so they will agree to it. Somewhat more difficult case is the one where you have a legal change which is desirable from the standpoint of customers of one rights enforcement agency, undesirable from the standpoint of customers of a different agency. And we can imagine, at least if we're economists, we can imagine that the first agency, my agency, does a little market research. And it decides that if it could get a court that agreed to capital punishment in disputes between it and Mr. Smith's agency, its customers in total would be willing to pay an extra $500,000 a year for the improved service because its customers, for some reason, are pro-capital punishment customers. So it suggests to Mr. Smith's agency that perhaps they should find a court that believes in capital punishment. And Mr. Smith's agency does some market research, and it discovers that its customers don't like capital punishment. In fact, it concludes that its customers would be willing to pay $1 million more for its services if it could guarantee that in disputes with customers of my agency, there would be no risk of getting executed because they would be going to a court that didn't have capital punishment. In that case, what would you expect to happen? You would expect the two agencies to agree on a non-capital punishment court, and Mr. Smith's agency to do something else for my agency, to offer a subsidy, to offer to agree to some other legal rule that they like, some sort of an implicit or explicit side payment, because both of them are bargaining to try to maximize their income from the service they're selling. And any time that two parties to a contract can find a change that produces a net benefit, there's always some way of dividing that net benefit up that benefits both. So that means that the private courts in this system are trying to design good law. They're trying to design law which maximizes the total benefit to the customers. Now, I'm going to hedge on that a little bit later, but let's take that as at least starting point. Let's compare that to democracy. Because you might say, look, the legislators who make our law also want to benefit everybody because they'll get more votes if they do. But there are a couple of major differences. To begin with, the individual voter in a democracy has no incentive to know what his legislator is doing or what the effects are of what he's doing, because the individual voter knows that his vote has very close to zero chance of determining the outcome of the election. So I could spend many hours of time figuring out what my congressman is doing and figuring out whether the bills that my congressman votes for are ones that are good for me or bad for me. Be hard to do, of course. One could go into that. But even if I did it, it wouldn't be worth anything except as entertainment, because having found that out and having decided my congressman is a good guy or a bad guy, I now know that my vote won't, in fact, keep him or get rid of him. On the other hand, in the system I've described, I can freely choose which rights enforcement agency I choose to be a customer of. So if I find that a different rights enforcement agency has managed to contract for a collection of courts for settling its disputes, which have law that I like better than mine, I can switch agencies, quit one, become a customer of another. So just as in ordinary market contexts, the individual has an incentive to be well informed because he gets to choose what he gets. I like to imagine as a demonstration of why democracy works so badly. Suppose the way we bought cars was that you put together a group of 1,000 people and you said, all right, you've got a month to do your research. At the end of that, we'll have a vote on which car all of you will buy. And whichever car gets the most vote, all of you will then buy it. It would not make sense to spend very much time and effort testing cars or reading consumer reports or talking to friends with different cars, because you would know that however much work you did, the car you got would be the one everybody else voted for, and probably not. Whether you got it wouldn't be determined by how you voted. That's how we make laws. Right? So the argument I'm offering is, first, there's no incentive to be well informed in the democratic system. But second, it's very hard to, because in the case of the private market for law, the alternatives are all out there to be compared. You can say, well, look, how do I know that my agency is doing a lousy job of protecting me? My neighbor, who's a customer of a different agency, pays the same amount I do. I had 3 break-ins last year. Only one of them did they ever catch the guy, and they didn't get my stuff back. My neighbor had only 1 break-in. Maybe the burglars know something about whose rights enforcement agency does a good job. And that break-in, his agency caught the guy in 2 days, brought back his stuff, everything was fine. So in the private system, you've got alternatives which you can actually look at and observe and choose among. We're never going to find out what the McCain administration would have been like. All right. The last election, I don't think I voted for anybody because I didn't like the Libertarian candidate, who wasn't very Libertarian. But on the whole, going into the last election, I thought Obama was probably a less bad bet than McCain. I didn't think either of them was a very good gamble, but on the whole, I thought that, as in the election before that, the problem with electing the Republican is he would do the same things as the Democrat, but we'd get blamed for it, because he would use rhetoric of the free market while doing very unfree market things, and there would be bad consequences, and people would say, look how badly the free market works. Whereas if you elect the Democrat, he does the same bad things, but at least we aren't the ones who get the blame. Looking back, I was probably wrong. I think Obama probably managed to be not only a worse president than Bush, which took some doing, but probably a worse president than McCain would have been. But we'll never know. So we don't get to observe those 2 alternative administrations. Whereas I do get to observe 2 alternative cars, 2 alternative grocery stores, 2 alternative restaurants, and compare among them. And similarly, in a system where law was privately produced, I would be able to compare alternative legal systems and alternative mechanisms, firms for enforcing the law, for protecting people's rights. So anarcho-capitalism, the private market for law, solves both the problem of giving you an incentive to evaluate the product and of giving you the ability to evaluate the product. The title of this talk is Anarchy and Efficient Law. So let me now make a very brief digression into what economists mean by efficiency. This comes out of a problem economists face. And the problem economists face is that people ask us, what should we do? Should we abolish tariffs? Should we have minimum wage laws? Should we do this? Should we do that? And the economist, as a good value-free scientist, says, I'm sorry, the Department of Moral Philosophy is down the hall. I don't answer should questions. I can tell you, if you have a tariff, this will happen. If you have a minimum wage law, that will happen. But whether it's good or bad, that's not economics. People aren't satisfied by that answer. And eventually the economists give in and they say, here's what we'll do. We will offer a criterion of goodness, which we're going to call economic efficiency, which has two characteristics. One of them is we think it's at least pretty closely related to what you're interested in, that the fact that something is more efficient is a pretty good reason to think that we would prefer it, though not a conclusive reason. And second, it comes closer to what you're asking than any other criterion for which we can answer the question. And what is this criterion? It comes out of the work of Alfred Marshall, who was an economist who a little more than 100 years ago more or less put modern economics together. And Marshall defined an economic improvement as a change where the value to those who benefited from it was larger than the cost to those who lost from it. And what does that mean? We imagine some change, let's say imposing a tariff. And we say, if everybody knew all of the effects on him of this change, how much would each person be willing to pay either to get the change or to block it? And that's a measure of the value to him or the disvalue to him of that change. And we just add it up. If imposing a tariff benefits the auto industry and the auto unions and landowners in Detroit by $500 million, and if it injures consumers of automobiles and farmers and various other people by $1 billion, those numbers are way too low, but taking for an example, we then say, well, on net, the cost of that tariff is larger than the benefit, summed over the people who were affected by it. Therefore, the tariff makes us worse off. Therefore, abolishing a tariff improves economic efficiency. Creating a tariff lowers economic efficiency. I should say Marshall didn't call it economic efficiency. That's a later terminology. And you can think of various reasons why it's an imperfect measure of what's good or bad. If you're sufficiently curious, you can find discussions of that question in 3 of my books, 2 of which are available online. But it is the criterion economists use. And if you think about the system I've been describing where law is produced on the market, you can see that to at least a first approximation it's going to tend to generate efficient law. That if some change in the legal rule between me and you produces benefits for you larger than the costs to me, it's going to pay the private court to make that change because it will find that after appropriate bargaining by the agencies, it can sell its services for a higher price if it makes that change than if it doesn't. So it looks like a mechanism which, like ordinary private markets, is going to tend to generate an efficient outcome. It's going to tend to make those changes that produce net benefits. Now, it doesn't do that perfectly. At this point, I think the discussion may be of more interest to economics students than to other people because it gets a little bit technical. But it doesn't do it perfectly for the same reason that Apple does not perfectly design computers by the same criteria. That Apple has a monopoly. It's something referred to by economists as monopolistic competition, meaning that it is competing with other firms, but it's competing with firms that produce products that are significantly different. So there are some people who are on the margin between using a Macintosh computer and a Windows computer. And Apple has to pay attention to those people because if it makes the Mac a little bit better, some of the ones now using Windows will switch to the Mac. And if it makes the Mac a little bit worse, some people now using Macs will switch to Windows. But Apple could make the Macintosh a good deal worse than it now is, or raise its price noticeably, and I wouldn't stop using a Mac. I'm a hardcore Mac user. I've been using them more or less as long as they've existed, and I have strong taste in them. And consequently, Apple can pretty much ignore my preferences when they're deciding how to design the computer. That what they have to focus on are the preferences of the people who are on the margin between Mac and Windows, or Mac and Linux, or Mac and no computer. Similarly, in my legal system, if my rights enforcement agency happens to produce a bundle of services that's exactly what I like, or at least much closer to what I like than anybody else provides, then when they switch to having or not having capital punishment, which we'll imagine I have opinions on, they don't have to worry about me because they're not going to pull me in. I'm a customer already. They're not going to drive me out. And therefore, like a firm in monopolistic competition, these firms are going to be focusing on the marginal customers. And that means that they're really not adding up all gains and all benefits. They're adding up a sort of an approximate measure of that, which is weighted towards the people who are more or less on the edge between different enforcement agencies. So in that respect, it's not perfectly efficient. There's another respect which is perhaps more interesting, and that is that my firm and Mr. Smith's firm are going to care about effects of their legal rules that affect their customers, but they aren't going to care about effects of their legal rules that affect other people's customers. And let me give you the example that seems to be clearest for that, and that's intellectual property law. Suppose the two agencies are bargaining over whether or not to respect copyright. And when they agree to respect, if they agree to respect copyright, that imposes certain costs and certain benefits. It's a benefit to me as an author because it means that people who are customers of the other firm who want to read my books will have to pay me royalties. It's a cost to the customers because it means that if they want to read my books, they'll have to pay me royalties. And at first glance, you would say, well, that's a wash. It benefits me by just as much as it costs them. We really shouldn't care. And that's wrong. It's wrong for two different reasons. One of them is that there are some costs to enforcing copyright law, so that from that standpoint, the benefit to me will be less than the cost to them. But the second reason is that the existence of copyright law gives authors an incentive to write books, and musicians an incentive to create music. And other people, patent law gives inventors an incentive to create inventions. The problem in my system, though, is that the benefit of my writing more books partly goes to customers of my agency and of Mr. Smith's agency, but most of it goes to people who are customers of neither agency. So when my agency and Mr. Smith's agency agree that copyright law will apply among their customers, they are producing a benefit to me, a cost to the customers, the people who buy my books, and a benefit to everybody in the world who might want to read my books. They will ignore all of that benefit except the part that goes to their customers. And it therefore might be the case that even if the net benefits from copyright law were larger than the net costs, that the benefits to those two agencies of the copyright law would be less, and therefore they wouldn't have copyright law even if it were economically efficient to have it. Now, I'm not expressing an opinion as to whether copyright law and patent law are good or bad things. That's a complicated issue and would require another talk and would still not have a clear answer. I think that copyright law is on its way out for purely technical reasons, that where intellectual property is mostly in digital form, it becomes very hard to enforce copyright law, and therefore people are finding other ways of getting paid for what they produce. But the point here is that even if copyright law and patent law are good things, you might not get them under the institutions I recommend. So that's a problem. On the other hand, since the alternative institutions, namely governments producing law, there's no incentive at all, or very little incentive, to produce good law. The fact that the private market will produce imperfectly good law, that it will have certain faults, just as other private markets do. That after all, if you think about the market for cars or the market for farm goods or almost anything else, with a little imagination, you can always come up with some way in which the arrangement between me and you affects him for good or for bad. So therefore, ordinary markets don't do a perfect job of generating economic efficiency. They just come closer than any other institutions we know of. And I'm arguing that exactly the same thing would be true of the market for law that I've been discussing. It won't do a perfect job of generating economically efficient law, but it will come closer than any alternative that I can think of. A further point sort of for the economists, and that is that at first glance what I'm describing looks like a competitive market, but it really isn't in the ordinary sense. Suppose we forget about the middlemen, the agencies, and think about it the same way you think about economics at the beginning of an econ course, in terms of individuals dealing with each other. There is a market for legal assent. That is to say, in some way, you and I have got to agree on the legal rules that will apply between us. And I'm describing a system where it's done for us by middlemen, but you can eliminate that in your imagination and try to think of what's basically going on. And you might think the market for legal assent is a competitive market, because there are, after all, 300 million other people just in America who I'm buying legal assent from. I want agreement with each other person on the laws between us. But it isn't a real competitive market, because on a competitive market, each of the sellers is selling a good that's a substitute for what the other ones sell. So if I could buy a pound of flour from you and a pound of flour from him, or I could buy 2 pounds of flour from you. I can buy legal assent from you. I can buy legal assent from him. But I can't buy 2 legal assents from you because you can't agree to the rules between me and him. All right? So in that sense, again, for any economists who are listening, or econ students, you want to think of the efficiency not as coming out of the standard economic model of perfect competition, which this isn't, but of something out of something closer to Coasian bargaining, to the idea that parties can bargain their way to efficient rules between them. And then in the arrangement that I'm describing, that bargaining is being done for them indirectly by the agencies that represent. I've really said most of what I have to say, but it occurs to me that there's one point that some people might find interesting, and this has to do with my claim that the enforcement agencies in my system are going to settle by arbitration rather than by violence. It turns out that we have some experimental evidence on this question. And the evidence I'm thinking is not the interaction between governments, between nations, which in a way is somewhat analogous to my case, but rather the interaction between insurance companies. Think about the situation for auto insurance. Your car runs into my car, and there's a dispute. There are 2 ways that our insurance companies could settle that dispute. One of them is that one of them sues the other. That's an expensive way of settling a dispute, and it's a little hard to predict the results. The other is that they could bargain their way to an agreement. They could have some rules they've agreed to in advance, which say under these circumstances, this guy is responsible, under those circumstances, that guy is responsible. That, like my arbitration agencies in the legal context, is the low-cost way, which, however, depends on agreement. All right? Either insurance company could pull out of that and could say, we don't care what the rules are, we're going to sue you. That's very closely analogous to the fact that in my system, any rights enforcement agency could say, we don't care what the court says, we're going to fight for our customer. We observe that almost all auto accidents are in fact settled by the low-cost method. That auto companies very rarely go to court. They almost always settle these disputes between themselves by whatever rules of thumb they come up with, and that strikes me as interesting. Now, the other thing I should say before I'm ending is that there are 2 very important questions I have not dealt with, because they are not about whether my institutions will produce efficient law, they're about whether my institutions will work. And the first one is the stability question. The question of whether such a system would be stable, or whether you would end up with some group of rights enforcement agencies concluding that robbery is more profitable than production, getting together and reestablishing a government. That's one possibility, and you have to think about when that would or wouldn't happen. The other issue is the danger from other governments. That is the national defense problem. When I wrote Machinery of Freedom, one of the chapter was called National Defense, the Hard Problem. Because Somehow this set of institutions that I've described has got to make sure that no nation sees the territory, the ungoverned lands, as Bernard Vinci, I think, referred to it, as a tempting area to annex, loot, tax, and so forth. So there is the issue, which I hope to discuss at greater length when I do this third edition of my book, of how such a system would defend itself against potential aggressors. And there is the issue of under what circumstances the system would be stable and would keep on functioning the way I described, and in what circumstances it would end up by reestablishing government. And if people want to talk about those, I can talk about them in the question period, but since my topic today is anarchy and efficient law, not a general discussion of anarcho-capitalism, I thought I would leave it out this time. I think at this point I have finished my prepared presentation, and I am ready to take questions. I discovered long ago that one of the really nice things about answering a question is that when you answer a question, you know that at least one person in the audience is interested in what you're talking about. Something you don't always know when giving a talk. Thank you.
Great. Well, we definitely have some time for questions. Our first one here says, you seem to imply that in the absence of government, private courts would spontaneously arise to enforce property rights. How then do you explain that drug dealers in America, whose property rights are not enforced, have yet to set up private courts instead of continuously fighting each other's?
That's a good question, and of course it's broader than drug dealers. And I think the answer is that to some degree what I described does happen in criminal markets. My conclusion, at least a long time ago, is that what's called organized crime is not really a General Motors of crime, that large firms mostly don't succeed in criminal markets because for a large firm to function, it needs to send information up and down because the people at the president of the corporation has to make sure the people on the assembly line are doing their job. And that's a difficult thing to do when the same information that the boss needs to make sure his employees are doing their job is also the information the DA needs to put the boss in jail. So I think the evidence suggests that criminal markets usually have fairly small firms, and that what's called organized crime largely consists of mechanisms by which those firms settle their disputes. So in the cases where they don't settle them peaceably, obviously the ones you hear about, but I think to a considerable extent what happens is that I've paid you $50,000 for a bag of white powder that turned out to be talcum powder instead of heroin. I could just have you killed because, after all, we're in an industry where that service is available. But if I do that, I'm going to get a bad reputation. People won't want to deal with me. So instead, I go to the local capo, so to speak, and I say, here's the evidence this person cheated me. I want to have him killed. And the local capo calls you up and says, what's the evidence you didn't cheat him? And once it's been established that he's the bad guy and I'm the good guy, now when I have him killed, people won't mind. They'll just be more not to cheat me in the future. So I think some of that does happen, but certainly much less than what I'm describing. And I think the answer is that the working of markets depends a lot on information. It depends on people being able to know what the reputation of an enforcement agency or the reputation of a court is. And it is harder for reputational mechanisms to work in illegal markets because, again, the information that you need in order to prove to customers that you do a good job of selling the services you sell is also the information that the cops need in order to put you in jail. So I guess the answer I would make is, first, I think more of it happens than you assume. I think one should not trust the accounts of criminal markets that one gets from police and reporters, both of whom have their own incentives. There have been some academic studies of such markets, which I think are more, on the whole, more reliable. I discussed that a bit, I think, in my price theory textbook, which is also available for free from my webpage as a HTML file, I think, or a set of HTML files. But I also think that such institutions work a good deal less well in criminal markets due to the fact that it's hard to advertise, to have the equivalent of consumer reports. But it's a good question. You're right.
Okay, the next question. What might be the practical differences between protection agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and small for-profit companies?
I'm not sure I understand the question. That is, I would have said that protection agencies are small for-profit companies, but they are companies in a particular industry, in the industry of rights enforcement.
I actually think that says countries, not companies.
Oh, countries, not companies. Sorry, what's the difference between small countries and rights enforcement agencies? The answer is that countries which are territorial sovereigns, as essentially all countries are, the country is much less subject to competition for its customers, that it is much more costly for me to move to Canada, attractive country though in some ways Canada is, than it is for me to change insurance companies. And in the anarcho-capitalist system, changing your rights enforcement agency is like changing an insurance company. Now, it's not an all or none difference. I think the fact that countries do have to compete for taxpayers does to some extent constrain them. Maybe that's one reason why governments aren't even worse than they are. As some of you may know, my son Patri has had this project for years for what he calls seasteading. He's got the Seasteading Institute, which you can find on the web, which is the project of creating inexpensive floating housing. Floating in the sense of floating on oceans, not on ponds. And there are a number of arguments for it, but one of the arguments is that it makes taxpayers more mobile and therefore puts pressure on governments to treat them better. So that one way you could imagine seasteading implemented is that we have a collection of large rafts that a bunch of us are living on, floating 15 miles or 5 miles off the California coast, somewhere, let's say, inside U.S. territorial waters. We are probably, if not U.S. citizens, then U.S. residents. But if taxes get too high in the U.S. or the U.S. tries to enforce laws we don't like, we can make arrangements with Mexico or Canada or maybe someplace even farther away that would like to have us as taxpayers and call up some tugboats and our collection of rafts move into someone else's territorial waters. And in the more extreme version, our communities are outside of territorial waters, so they're not under any government's rule. And now, if 50,000 of us are together in a community and we decide we don't like each other, we have some serious disagreement, we pull our groups of rafts apart. Maybe we find some other people in another community who agree with us and they join with us. So you can imagine something much more like a fluid system with governments, but governments whose citizens were mobile. And I've sometimes thought that the internet may give us the equivalent of this without needing the floating housing. Because the more of your life is conducted online, the less you're tied to a particular location. It has occurred to me partly because when my daughter went off to college, she kept most of the same friends because most of her friends were people she interacted with online, not in real space. And if you imagine a future where most people are spending a very large part of their time online, where most social interactions are over the internet, where most of the ways in which people are earning their living are telecommuting in effect, in that world, the cost to me of picking up and moving to Canada is much lower than in the world I now live in. And the lower that cost is, the more governments will be constrained to treat people well. I don't know how many of you have read anything by C. Northcott Parkinson, who's best known for Parkinson's Law. He was an English academic who was very good at writing humorous essays making serious points. Parkinson's Law has two forms. Work expands to fill the time available, and the number of people employed by a bureaucracy increases at a constant rate, independent of whether the work to be done increases, decreases, or whether there's any work at all. Sounds like a joke, but then Parkinson gives you the data for the basically the civil service, the British Colonial Office, the civil service that was supporting the British Empire during the time when the British Empire was vanishing, and the number of bureaucrats kept going up. And he gives a similar data for the British Navy, for the onshore establishment of the Admiralty, during a time when the British Navy went from the most powerful navy in the world to barely able to beat Argentina. The number of bureaucrats kept going up. Another one of his essays deals with taxes. And the passage that I like is where he's talking about the bit in the Bible where the Israelites decide to leave Egypt. And he comments that the productive people of the world have discovered by long and bitter experience that they will usually have to pay about 10% of their income to some gangster, feudal lord, or Department of Internal Revenue. It matters little what you call it. When the rates get higher than that, the Israelites start looking at the atlas. There are probably better places to be than Egypt. Now, he was too optimistic with his numbers. Unfortunately, it's much higher than 10% nowadays. The basic argument is a legitimate argument. So I hope that answers at least some of your question. Let's see if somebody else has another one.
Next question is, right now, the rich pay for most of the government. Would the socioeconomically disadvantaged be able to afford protection from rights enforcement agents? Will they have to buy inferior rights protection?
Well, that's a good question. To begin with, I don't think it's true that the rich pay for most government. You get that impression if all you look at is the federal income tax. The federal income tax is very heavily weighted towards high incomes. On the other hand, state sales taxes are not. It's unclear what the real incidence of property tax is in terms of who ends up paying it. The payroll taxes that support Social Security and Medicare are regressive taxes, not progressive taxes. So it isn't clear to what extent the rich really pay for government. But the more important point is that if you actually look at how much government spend on police and courts, it turns out to be a tiny fraction of total government expenditure. I looked up the numbers, whatever it was, 35 years ago or 40 years ago when I was writing Machinery of Freedom. I don't know what the current figures are, but I would be astonished if as much as 5% of total government spending went to police and courts. So you're talking about a world where the poor people don't have to pay sales tax on what they buy, where the price of their housing isn't driven up by property taxes, where those of them who are employed are not paying payroll taxes. And I think that for most poor people, other than those at the very bottom, you would find that the total cost of rights enforcement would be much less than what they're now paying for government. Now, that being said, I assume that if rights enforcement is being sold on a private market, as with other goods, people who are willing to pay more are going to be able to get higher quality. So if you have a sort of a bare bones $100 a year rights enforcement policy, if somebody robs you, something may eventually happen to him, but you don't expect the police to show up at your door 10 minutes later. Whereas if you've got the gold-plated policy, you do. And that, I think, would probably be the case. As with, rich people get to eat better food at better restaurants, too, for the same reason. I should also say that there are an awful lot of things our present governments do that make poor people poorer. So that we would be talking about a world without minimum wage laws, about a world where you can cut hair without first taking 200 hours of courses in hair cutting in order to qualify for a barber's license, in which you can be a beautician or a flower arranger or do anything else, or start a small business without having to go through elaborate licensing procedures and so forth. So I think you would see a lot less poverty. One fact which I think is interesting and most people aren't aware of, if you actually look at poverty rates in the U.S. In the period since World War II, which is what we have data for, the pattern is pretty striking. That from World War II until the time when the war on poverty comes online, the poverty rate by a constant definition is declining quite substantially. I don't remember the numbers anymore, but probably by the end of that period, probably the number of poor people, or percentage of poor people, was probably something like half or a third of what it was in 1947 or 48. From about the point when the war on poverty really gets going, not when the laws are passed, but when the agencies are actually staffed and funded, from then till now, the poverty rate has been roughly constant. It goes up and down with the economy, of course. But it at least looks, insofar as you can judge by numbers, and of course you never can be sure that your statistics are giving you the right answer, but it looks as though the greatly increased government involvement in trying to reduce poverty resulted in stopping the reduction of poverty. When the war on poverty was declared, the stated purpose was not to make being poor pleasanter, which welfare to some extent does. It was to get people not to be poor And by that standard, if anything, it looks as though it had precisely the opposite of its intended purpose. Next question.
Critics of anarchism say your ideas are inapplicable to today's world. Aside from snapping our fingers and magically realizing the society you've described, what conditions have to exist for the society to be realized? How best to get from here to there?
That's a good question. I have a chapter in Machinery of Freedom which is called How to Get From Here to There, and starts out with, you can't get there from here, quote unquote, quote, you can't get there from here, unquote, old joke, I hope. I guess my view is that part of the way you get there is just by changing ideas, by what I'm trying to do at the moment, that if many people see a society without government as a viable option, that then the arguments for government power become weaker. And the other thing you do is you move continuously by replacing particular things the government does. I don't know how many of you are old enough to realize that there was a time when if you wanted to send a package somewhere, you took it to the post office. That's no longer the case. Well, in the world of 1950, where the only way for almost anybody of getting letters and packages delivered was a government agency, it was natural enough to say if we had no government, there would be no mail delivery. Whereas nowadays, it's pretty obvious to anybody who thinks about it that if the post office went closed down tomorrow, the United Parcel Service and FedEx would take over everything you're doing by the next week, because they're already doing all the parts of it they're allowed to do, and the only reason that private firms aren't delivering first-class mail is that doing so is against the law. So any time that you can successfully create private institutions that replace governmental institutions, you are moving us a little bit closer to a world in which they're all replaced. I suppose the same would be true of schooling. My kids have been homeschooled for quite a while. Well, at this point, one of them is in college and the other is going to college shortly. But they were homeschooled. Before they were homeschooled, they were in a very small private school run on rather unconventional lines, which I could discuss on some other occasion. And I've been part of the attempt to push voucher systems as a way of getting government, if not out of paying for schooling, at least out of running it. If you had a widespread voucher system and if 50 or 60 or 70% of the kids were going to private schools, and if most parents could see that the taxes they were paying for public schools were costing them more than it would cost to educate their kids in private schools, then the pressure to maintain a government-run schooling system would be much less. So I think, in my view at least, that the two, what seem to me the two most useful approaches are first spreading ideas and second creating institutions that replace government with private institutions.
If you don't mind, we've actually got a lot of questions left. You can stick around for another 10 minutes, David.
That's fine.
Okay, next question. Why do you assume that people are profit maximizers as opposed to power maximizers?
I'm not sure what profit maximizing means. I assume that people have objectives and that they wish to achieve those objectives, and that the best way of predicting their behavior is to assume that individuals will tend to take the actions that best achieve their objectives. Now, there surely are some people for whom power over others is an objective itself, but I would have thought that for most people, power over others is mostly important because it lets them achieve other objectives. If I can order you around, I can order you to clean my house for me. Therefore, to put it a little differently, let me put the thing a little, I think the power that is most valuable to most people is power over themselves. That you would be willing to bear some cost to be able to order me around, but typically I would be willing to bear a much larger cost to not have you able to order me around. And that therefore, in a market context, it will be very rare that the people who want to exert power on others are willing to pay a higher price for that than the people who they would exert it on are willing to pay to prevent it. So in that sense, let me go back a step. I want to distinguish anarcho-capitalism from libertarianism. That there, in what I've said so far, there is nothing inconsistent between an anarcho-capitalist society and, let us say, laws against marijuana. One could imagine an anarcho-capitalist society in which it turned out that the arbitration agencies were all agreed on legal rules by which you could be punished for smoking marijuana. I don't think it's likely. I don't think it's likely because I think that in general, freedom pays, so to speak. That is to say, a libertarian legal system is defined as one that has certain sorts of laws that give individual freedom. An anarcho-capitalist society is a particular set of institutions. The linkage between them is that the anarcho-capitalist society, for reasons I've been trying to describe, will tend to give you efficient legal rules, to give you legal rules that maximize some benefits. And in most, though not necessarily all cases, a legal rule that increases freedom is worth more to those who become freer than its cost to those who are no longer able to coerce them. So in that sense, I would expect there to be a close relation between the legally efficient, between economically efficient laws of anarcho-capitalism and the free laws of a libertarian society, but they aren't identical. The thesis that my institutions would produce libertarian laws is, as it were, a theorem to be proved, not a definition. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but in any case, I don't assume that nobody wants power, but I assume that not many people are willing to pay the price that power would cost them on a free market.
The next question, how dependent upon general acceptance of a rights protection firm's legitimacy of the use of violence is the establishment of these firms? Could such a firm or group of firms effectively set up in Somalia serving 10% of the populace while being labeled as demonic by the other 90%?
Huh. It's an interesting question, the whole question of legitimacy. And I have a discussion in a number of places of the question of what defines government. And the closest I can come is that in human societies, people have a set of commitment strategies. That basically, there are certain things if you do to me, I'm willing to go to quite a lot of trouble to stop you doing. And that what's special about a government is that it's an organization against which people drop those strategies. So a government can do things to people without calling forth strong opposition, which a private organization couldn't do. And I'm not sure if that's relevant to your question or not. I think that certainly it's going to work a whole lot better if you have a culture where people say, well, all right, these organizations behaving in this way are legitimate, whereas doing certain things aren't, as long as it's the right things. I think in Somalia, as I understand it, considerable parts of Somalia are under not my system, but a sort of non-state legal system, a traditional legal system. One of my students last year, I think, did a paper on the Somali legal system. And if you look hard enough on my webpage and go to the webpage for my seminar on legal systems very different from ours, you can probably find the paper on Somalia. But I think if you have a society where a lot of people think of themselves as at war with each other, it's going to be very hard to make things peaceful, which is one reason why it would be hard to establish what I'm describing by a revolution as opposed to a sort of gradual evolution. I sort of like the picture in Snow Crash, for those who have read that, of a society which is an anarcho-capitalist society, but there's still a government. It just doesn't do anything anymore. There are still people who out of habit go to the government buildings every day, but they have no power. And I think that that kind of slow, continuous evolution is probably more likely to give you a peaceful and attractive system than something. I don't think that answers all of your questions. I hope it answers part of it.
What do you think are the factors that would contribute to the effectiveness of those non-legal sanctions whenever a party refuses to comply to the decision of a private arbiter?
I'm not sure I understand you. In my system, we say non-legal sanctions, the sanctions if you've stolen my computer and the court that our agencies have agreed on finds that you're guilty, the sanction consists of some big strong men coming to your house, smashing down the door if you won't open it, and carrying the computer away. That is to say, my agencies are engaged in using force when they have to. Of course, from the standpoint of a libertarian, there's nothing wrong with using force. There's only something wrong with initiating force. so that the sense in which my agencies are not governments is that they're only doing the same things that we believe any private individual can do as long as he's in the right. That, when I see you carrying my computer out the door, I'm entitled to beat you up and, grab the computer back. And so is my agency. So I'm not sure what you mean by non-legal force, except in that it's not a legal system because there's no government. But I do think that there are ways in which, other than violent use of force, you could get things sort of like what I'm describing. I've got a number of things I've written about online contract enforcement. I've got an article you can find on my webpage called Contracts in Cyberspace. And I argue there that you can get quite a lot of what I'm describing simply using reputational enforcement rather than violent enforcement. And that depends on the fact that online interactions are in a sense all voluntary. You can't get a bullet through a T1 Live. And therefore, it may be sufficient that if I sign a contract with you and then break it, then other people who might want to deal with me can discover the fact, at which point they don't deal with me, and therefore it's in my interest to keep the contract. But if you're interested in that part, which is within our current institutions a sort of a non-legal form of rights enforcement, or at least contract enforcement, look at the article in, I think it's in the academic work, law, and economics part of my webpage, but it might be in the libertarian writing part of my webpage. The article is called Contracts in Cyberspace. As you can see here, if you're seeing my screen, my webpage starts out with 4 worlds, one of which is pictures of my cute kids, one of which is my academic work, one of which is libertarian writing, and one of which is my activity in researching medieval recipes and building Renaissance chairs and doing various other things of that sort.
The next question.
I've got my second novel is now available as a Kindle file. Anybody wants to read it, and it actually might be of some interest to libertarians. One of the reasons I wrote that novel was I had a conversation with Werner Vinge, who is a successful science fiction writer and also a libertarian and a friend of mine, and I told him I had 2 different ideas for second novels to write. And he persuaded me to do this one, in part because in an indirect way it deals with some issues interesting to libertarians, although it deals with them in a fantasy context rather than a modern real-world context. Here, I can even show you, since you can see my screen. This ought to get me to the Kindle file for my second novel, which is there, which I hope some of you will read and like, and which in a way is about the central planning fallacy, only in a fantasy context with magic rather than in the context of a modern economy. Central planning fallacy is the very persuasive idea that if only some sensible person had control over all of the vast resources of society, what wonderful things he could do. And I have something analogous in a fantasy context, and it's a mistake there too for some of the same reasons. Next question.
Okay, we have time for about 2 more questions. When dealing with this subject, I'm often asked something along the lines of what happens when someone doesn't have a rights enforcement agency. How would you respond? What happens when someone is purported to have committed a crime who does not have a rights enforcement agency? What about when someone who does not have a rights enforcement agency is the victim of a crime?
Well, I would say that both of them are out of luck. What happens when somebody doesn't buy any groceries and gets hungry? That if you could obviously take a chance. If you're pretty sure you're in a safe society, you might choose not to pay for a rights enforcement agency. I expect if you're a victim of a crime that probably at some price an existing rights enforcement agency will be willing to take it on, but since their normal price is for only a small chance of having to investigate a crime, they will doubtless charge you more if you're trying to hire them after the fact than before. If you commit a crime, if the victim has an agency, the agency comes after you. My guess is that rights enforcement agencies dealing with people who don't have agencies will be somewhat restrained because, after all, if the criminal knows that you're going to shoot, the people coming after him are going to shoot to kill, he may shoot first. So they might very well choose in that world to offer the defendant a trial of some sort. But they don't have to. He doesn't have any mechanism other than his own strength to defend himself, and he has chosen not to hire a firm that will stand up for him. So that's a good reason why in that society you ought to be customer rights enforcement agency. I point out, however, that in our society, you are, so to speak, the customer of a government, whether you want to be or not, and you pay for it, whether you want to or not. And it seems to me a system where some bad things can happen if you choose not to buy something is rather better than a system in which you are compelled to buy that something, which is what we now have. I was just going to take a moment to point you with the other things on the web page. I've got a quote of the month, which doesn't really change every month. I have a link here to my books, of which a number of them, as you can see, are available for free online. There's a price theory book. There's my first novel is available both as podcasts, if you like listening to things, and written. My second novel is available as a Kindle file. My book, Future Imperfect, is available for free online. So is my book, Law's Order, and so is Machinery of Freedom and Price Theory. So a bunch of my books are available for free online. Next question. Any more questions? Are we out of time?
I'm sorry. For our last question, we'd like to know how your academic background in physics has informed you and your economic beliefs.
I like to say that the one advantage of having a doctorate in theoretical physics is that I get to do non-mathematical economics without having people conclude that I'm afraid of mathematics. In my view, although mathematics certainly can be a useful tool in economics, there's too much of it at present, has been for quite a while. There's a lot of what my friend Gordon Tullock refers to as ornamental mathematics, where the math doesn't actually add anything important to what you're saying, it's just used to impress people. And there's too much of, I want to have a publishable article, if I use some new mathematical trick to do something that looks publishable, and therefore I will. So I think it is useful for an economist to be mathematically competent. There are some things where you can think them through more clearly in the language of math than in the language of speech. But there's a famous quote from Alfred Marshall from a letter he wrote to someone where he explained that he worked out his ideas mathematically to make sure they were right. He then translated what he had done into ordinary English. And if he was unable to translate it into English, he burned the mathematics. And I think there is much to be said for that attitude.
Well, we're all out of time for questions, but if there's a way for everyone to get in touch with you afterwards, is that possible?
Sure, I have an email. My email, I'm not sure whether the email address is probably on my webpage. I'm pretty sure that my webpage has a link at the bottom with my email address. Let me check that that's the case. Yes, here's my email address, which is at the bottom of my webpage, so you can just click on that. So the simplest thing is to go to my webpage, which is www.daviddfriedman.com. And from there, you can find a bunch of my books you can read for free, a bunch of my articles you can read for free, and at the bottom, my email address.
Great. Well, we'll definitely make sure everyone has that afterwards. Thank you so much, David, and all of our participants this evening. I hope you all can continue coming back to our webinars to learn more throughout the year. Our next webinar is next Wednesday, May 25th. James Stacey Taylor will be delivering a talk on the meaning and value of autonomy. To register, visit our website, studentsforliberty.org. You'll also be sent a link to register in a follow-up email. In the email, you will also receive a survey to evaluate the webinar tonight. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. It helps us to know how to improve our programs and make webinars more interesting for you. And with that, I think we're officially wrapped up. Thank you again for your time this evening, and have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you all.